So Hartley Lifecare, we're a Canberra-based disability service provider. We've been in operation for 60 years next year. We actually celebrate our 60th anniversary next year, which is pretty amazing. We provide a variety of services around, individual community supports, short-term accommodation or respite care. We've got a hydrotherapy pool as well, but our core service is supported independent living. So that essentially means we have now over 35 houses in the ACT where we provide in-home support for people living with a disability. That's probably 90% of the work that we do. In terms of history, we've grown quite substantially since the NDIS was introduced, the National Disability Insurance Scheme in 2016. So back then we had, I think, from memory, only about 40 odd clients. We've essentially doubled that over the past 5 or 6 years. So the growth we've experienced since the introduction of the NDIS has been quite substantial. And I think that's a reflection of, the impact that scheme has had on people living with a disability. In terms of other areas for our organisation, fundraising and events. So we are obviously funded mainly and primarily by the NDIS, but we also have a lot of fundraising initiatives that kind of pay for the things that aren't funded by the scheme. Things such as our fleet, client holidays, little kind of things that really put the icing on the cake to let our clients, live their best lives. My title is Senior Manager of Finance and Communications. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. So I'm an accountant by trade. So my role did primarily start with finance around obviously managing the funding that we receive, budgeting, reporting, all those kind of finance and accounting roles. Since then, it's grown into the fundraising and communications and marketing area as well. So primarily, I've got a team of around 10, which is a mix of, finance, payroll, fleet management, procurement, also IT, and then the other kind of areas around, the fundraising, the events, the marketing side of things as well. So it's an interesting position, but it's one very much enjoy, and, enjoy the challenges that come with the NDIS. It's no secret that there's been headaches in the sector for quite a while now. So the constant challenges are certainly thrown up every week. And it's funny when someone asks me, what are you doing this week? Honestly, my answer is, who knows? We'll see what arises. So that's essentially my role in a nutshell. Over 90% of our workforce is obviously support workers, so the frontline staff that are out amongst our houses providing our clients with best practice supports. So that's primarily our core workforce. We then have an admin staff of around 25, I think, which obviously supports the houses around key functions like human resources, finance, business and operations, and then obviously the client services side of things where we've got disability programs managers, and they're there's 8 of those that have their own network, and each of those networks has about 5 or 6 houses in them. So although 90% is the frontline workers, that other 10% is also integral in terms of the operation of the business. Very unique, and I think that was because we were under quite an outdated and old collective agreement, so one that was formed in 2008. We had constant challenges because it was so grey in so many areas. We were constantly going to Fair Work, getting legal advice around things that we just weren't sure on, and we weren't comfortable making assumptions on. So that kind of triggered a look at transitioning to the SHADS award. And the key worry, I suppose, we had with our rostering process was because we're moving something that was so grey and broad to something that was a little more black and white, but also very complex in the SHADS award. we were very nervous about things such as overtime. So our older collective agreement didn't have an overtime clause in it, so we didn't actually pay it. So we were worried about, interpretations around that. And I'm sure in your experience, you've seen how complex that award is. So it was the main concern we had, and probably drove the motivation to engage Workforce Analytics, was around being compliant, and making sure we weren't breaking any industrial awards, as well as obviously the financial aspect as well. We were doing some pretty scary forecasting around what it would look like when we transition to the shads, if we were to keep the rosters we had in place. That was because of excess hours, non-compliance under the shads, but it was compliant under the EA and collective agreements. So yeah, they were the main, I suppose, motivators and concerns with our rosters. It was a double-edged sword. So in the past probably 2 years, we've seen a reduction in NDIS funding. So the government is certainly cutting back on what's funded for our clients. And then on the cost side of things, it was the transition of the shads, a few unknowns there. We had some pretty open conversations at board level around the future of our organisation and its viability. And we had open conversations with our staff as well. So all the executive team at the start of the year, before we engaged Workforce Analytics, attended staff meetings at houses to kind of explain why we were going through this process. It was our third go at a roster restructure. And by roster restructure, what triggered the first one over 12 months ago now was COVID. So we were trying to isolate people to networks to ensure that there wasn't, a staff member working across multiple houses, because that would spread the virus in a worst case scenario. So that triggered our first restructure. The second restructure was triggered by the transition of the shads, to which got us compliant under the award. So from a compliance standpoint, we were happy. Unfortunately, though, the overtime element was there, and the forecasting that I was doing was suggesting that if we were to continue with those rosters under the shads award, we would simply cease to exist in about 3 or 4 years. So that was taken at board level, and obviously the board said, well, we need to do something here. We had an out of session board meeting to kind of like a financial planning day. And that kind of really cemented the fact that we needed to engage some specialist roster experts to come in and optimize them to make sure that they were viable. Because yeah, the forecasting that I was looking at was quite scary. Yeah, of course. I mean, first and foremost would be how the impact would be on our clients, and then obviously our staff as well. You start mentioning stuff like roster restructures, optimization. They're scary words for staff. You start thinking about reduced hours. You start thinking about redundancies. It's quite confronting. So that was felt from board level down to the executive through the whole organisation. And I think we're very proud to say that I think as it currently stands, there hasn't been any redundancies as part of this process. There's been lost hours, which has been tough, no doubt. But, from what I've seen so far, no redundancies. The impact on the clients has been minimal, if not any. So that was the number one concern is, how is this going to impact our clients and also our staff? Because we've had such a great culture for such a long time, and we've prided ourselves on our culture amongst our workforce. They're our number one asset. So we didn't want to be doing anything that would rock the boat in that sense. But we were quite open with our staff in saying, we need to do this. Otherwise, you'll be looking for another job in the next few years because we won't be here. And I think as soon as that message kind of came across as to why, it wasn't just a pure money grab. It wasn't just a cut cost project. It was something that needed to be done because of, as I said, the double-edged sword around funding and also the impacts of overtime on our finances and viability. I think it's been one of the strengths of all three restructures, to be honest, has been the communication. We've tried to regularly communicate with our staff, from Eric, our CEO, through our managers and supervisors at house level. The introduction of workforce analytics was one that needed to be a little bit more delicate because of the introduction of an external third party. It seemed a lot less personal, I think, at staff level, which is totally understandable. And so we opened our doors, so to speak, to say, if you had question or concern, come see us. As I said before, all the senior managers attended staff meetings. So we said to our supervisors, your next team meeting at the houses, send us invites. At least one or two of us will be there to front up and answer questions. And speaking for myself, I'm not sure about the other senior managers, but that experience was fantastic because it cemented for me how amazing our staff are, because they kind of nodded, they understood, they asked some really good questions, but at the end of the day, they fully understood why it was happening, and why it needed to happen. I'm sure Shiloh will probably speak to this a lot better than I will, but from my experience, Lauren was fantastic in terms of we had, I think it was about might have been an all-day meeting, to be honest. It was an all-day meeting with each of the programs managers to understand their networks, to understand their rosters, to understand their staff. And, we sat in the training room. Although it was done online, it still felt very personal, and that, that Workforce was invested in this with us, which is a big thing to have when you're using external contractors, because, we've all had experience with the external ones. They come in, it's like a tornado. They provide you with a report. Sometimes that report just goes on the bookshelf, never be read again. Whereas, excuse me, whereas this project was definitely, a lot more invested from a standpoint. And so, the programs managers were very nervous prior to that initial meeting. And I think in all situations following that first meeting where it was discussed what the aim was, what they were doing, what the potential changes might look like, I think it put a lot of minds at ease initially. And then the growth from that been even more amazing. So I know that when we initially engaged Workforce Analytics, there was an agreement that we'd only do 3 versions of the roster. I know for some houses there's been 4, 5, 6 versions, because Lauren and the team wanted to get it right and wanted to make sure that everyone was happy as far as they could be under the funding arrangements. So yeah. From a forecasting standpoint, almost immediately. So the results that have been coming through from the optimization results, I've already started doing some forecasting for the board. It's essentially, we were looking at a turnaround. So full disclosure, we were operating quite heavy deficits. We budgeted for a deficit this year. Excuse me. Yeah, we budgeted for quite a substantial deficit this year, whereas now we're looking at possibly and hopefully turning that around to a surplus maybe within the next 12 to 18 months, which is something that was, not definitely discussed at the start of the year. So I wouldn't say immediate, but in terms of a return on investment, we've saved around 4 to 5% of our wages per annum. When you put that into perspective, the investment with Workforce pays itself back within inside a year. So in that sense, it's been well worth the project. And the hope is that, when we touch base with you guys in the next 12 to 18 months, we'll be able to report back even more positive results. And that's going to allow us to grow. So at a strategic level, Hartley's wanted to potentially look at growing and crossing borders for a couple of years now. The holdback has been funding, viability. Our core service wasn't profitable. Now we're in a position where our core service could be back to a viable option that allows us then to have that discussion again about potential growth. Yes, absolutely. So from a pure numbers point of view, we did a phase 1 with roster right and Workforce, and that pretty much involved getting all our current rosters as they were and costing them as they would look like under the shads. And so we got all that data, we compared it to the funding we were receiving, and it was scary, very, very scary. And so as the new results have been coming through from our optimized rosters, we obviously have had the ability to compare that to what was going to be. And there's been significant savings there in terms of a turnaround in financial results. And as I said, it's been around a 5% of wages, which has been enough really to move a lot of our houses that were in a very precarious financial position into a position now where we're comfortable to continue providing service. And that was the difficult part of it, is that we had a lot of houses as we transitioned to the shads that tough conversations were incoming, with families, with clients, and with guardians. Those conversations now, we hope, don't have to happen. Again, Charlotte probably have more feedback on this, but I guess I can speak purely from a finance point of view. Extremely positive. So, at the past board meeting, I presented some forecasting based on initial results, which Lauren and the roster and workforce team provided. Extremely positive. So, the nervous part with quite a substantial investment is this going to work? Is it going to pay itself back? And the short answer for that has been yes, 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 because as I said, if you can get an investment of this level to pay itself back inside 12 months, it's a no-brainer. And so that has been a huge positive. In terms of client and staff impact, I guess it's hard to tell right now. The rosters haven't fully been rolled out. But as I said before, there's been no redundancies, which I think is a huge result. Yes, there's been reduced hours, and there are staff members that have been impacted, which is terrible. But again, a reality of why we have to do this, because those savings, so to speak, do have to come from somewhere, unfortunately, and sometimes it is through efficient hours. Other times it's through cutting back the hours to match up to what the client needs, but also to be financially viable. So conversations that were had prior to engaging Roster Right around heavily reduced hours, redundancies, staff leaving, disgruntled staff leaving, I haven't seen any of that yet. So touch wood, that'll stay as is. So as far as I can see so far, very, very positive. I think the thing that's made my life easier and probably made me sleep better at night is there are always unknowns when you transition to a new award as to what your payroll liability is going to be. And having Roster Right kind of put the numbers in concrete right in front of you makes my life easier in terms of forecasting where we're heading. And that's very important when you're going under heavily negotiations with the NDIS about funding. You want to know exactly where your costs are to know what you can kind of work with versus what you can turn around and say, look, sorry, we can't operate under that kind of funding arrangement. So having that concrete number there in place is certainly put my mind at ease. I know the board and Eric, the CEO as well, that, when we receive an offer for funding from the NDIS, we turn straight to our results sheet that we've got running at the moment, and we can make a very productive and strategic decision around whether we accept that funding or whether we turn around and fight for more. So in that sense, yes, absolutely made my life easier and made me sleep a lot better at night. Do it. In short, I think, we're all advocating at the moment for increases in funding. From our perspective, it's a tough battle, and it's a battle that, quite honestly, we're not winning right now. And that's just a reflection of the environment and where the NDIS and the NDIA sit. So we made a strategic decision at that point in time to say, well, we'll continue lobbying, but we can't put all our eggs in one basket. We need to start looking internally here to make sure we're running as efficiently as possible, so that when we are fighting for that funding, there's no doubt in our minds as an organisation that we are running a tight ship that's meeting our clients' needs as best we can. and yeah, putting our minds at ease from that point of view. Yeah, I think because your wage costs in an industry like SIL and like a service like SIL is 90 to 95% of your costs, and all your overheads are on top of that cost. So if you can make that efficient, and you can make sure that that is financially viable, the rest kind of falls into line and takes care of itself. So that's why it was such a, although scary investment at the time, it's been so worthwhile to kind of know where we're at and put into categories, say, well, here's our client needs, here's our staff needs and availability, here's what we're funded for. Let's look at all those three together in a big picture scheme and work out the perfect roster that meets all those needs as best it can, and then also is financially viable. Looking down a pretty dark hole. So as I said, the forecasting that I was doing at the start of the year, you hate throwing the word insolvency around, but it was definitely in discussion. We couldn't keep going the way we were going. We were going to sink. So we needed to start swimming somehow. And as I said, the lobbying was there for more funding, but the impact we could have internally as to operations more efficient. And 90% of our costs are wages. So you start with the biggest block in the organisational chain, and you say, how do we make this efficient? And that's where obviously roster right and workforce came to the party, and said, this is how we can help. They were quite open and transparent that they'd never done anything in our sector really before. They'd certainly provided examples around hospitality and a few other sectors, but this was the first time they were involved in disability services. But they also assured us of the fact that, rosters are rosters. So in terms of what they did, it really didn't matter what sector. It obviously did help in terms of, I suppose, the focus, I think, in their previous experience has been staff, and staff, whereas we brought in obviously an element of, no, our client needs are first, and then the staff are actually second to that, because we need to make sure that the client's needs were met. They engage us for a service. We have a duty of care to them. So that was number one. And then obviously the staff needs and their availability certainly obviously play a huge part of that, because they are our number one asset, and they do provide the frontline service that meets the client needs and makes them so happy. So, that would be my response to that. Yes, absolutely. So the return on investment for us is looking like it'll be inside 12 months. So you talk to anyone with financial kind of sense or knowledge, you tell them you can have a return on investment in inside 12 months, sign me up. So that's probably the first point. The second point is, the impact it's going to have on our overall viability as an organisation. Start of the year, we're doing scenarios with the board around, best case, worst case, medium case. We're looking at around a medium case, which looked at a deficit of probably $2.5 million this financial year. You keep doing that, you're not going to exist anymore. Whereas now the forecasting is looking like we can turn that deficit hopefully into a surplus in the next 12 to 18 months, and we're back on track. Our core service is profitable. As long as it stays like that, that allows us to continue to grow, continue to provide best service to our clients, employ members of the community. The question now has been around these roster restructures, are we going to have to do another one? And my answer is, if we have to do another one, it'll be for good reasons. It'll be for reasons because we are more viable now. We actually have a lot more room to move in terms of hours and things like that. In terms of where we're headed versus where we thought we were headed, it's been an extremely worthwhile investment. Absolutely. I'd be more than happy to talk to colleagues around putting their mind at ease. Be lying to say, as an executive and as the board were, not nervous or worried about what this would do to our culture and what this would do to our staff and our clients. We had many frank discussions around that and whether it was worthwhile. The reality was in the numbers and where the organisation was going. And I know there's other organisations in the sector that are having, as we speak, similar conversations around the viability of SIL and whether they can continue to operate in that space based on the current funding. And, as I would advise them that, continue your lobbying. We all are continuing our lobbying with the government to try and turn that around and really emphasise that the NDIS isn't an expenditure piece, it's an investment piece in our economy. What that brings to Australia and the communities that it's involved in is unbelievable. I think numbers are even starting to come out around what it does to the economy. So keep lobbying on that front, don't stop. But I think it's very important to turn the mirror inwards, so to speak, and look at your internal operations as well. And as I said, in a SIL space, 90% of it's going to be wages. So you start with your rosters. So make them as efficient as possible based on the client needs and what you're getting funded for. And you'll undoubtedly, in my opinion, see a turnaround in your financial results. If not immediately, definitely down the garden path in terms of what your forecasts look like.